The rain hammered against my windshield as I drove through the winding mountain roads of Bali, each drop feeling like a warning. I had received an invitation that morning, not the kind that arrives in a tourist brochure, but whispered through connections I'd cultivated over months of earning trust in these sacred villages. An invitation to witness what most foreigners never see, the true face of death in Bali. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent the better part of my life chasing shadows, seeking out the forbidden corners of our world where ancient truths still pulse with life. Tonight, I was about to step across a threshold that would change everything I thought I knew about mortality. The invitation came from Ketut, an elderly Balinese man whose weathered hands had prepared more bodies for their final journey than I could count. "You want to understand death," he had said, his eyes holding mine with unsettling intensity. "Then you must see what we hide from your people. But understand this, some knowledge comes with a price." As I pulled up to the village compound, the modern world felt like a distant memory. Oil lamps flickered in doorways, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The air was thick with incense and something else, something that made my skin prickle with ancient recognition. This wasn't the Bali of glossy travel magazines. This was older, deeper, more raw. Here, death wasn't sanitized or hidden away. Here, death was a neighbor, a teacher, a gateway to truths that civilized society has forgotten. Ketut emerged from the main house, his white sarong glowing in the lamplight. Behind him, I could see figures moving in the shadows, family members preparing for a ritual that would begin at dawn. But first, there were things I needed to understand. Things about the sacred boundaries I was about to cross. "The tourists come to Bali and see our ceremonies from afar," Ketut began, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "They photograph our towers, our processions. They think they understand. But the real work, the work that matters to the soul, this happens in the darkness, in the spaces between worlds where only family may enter." He gestured for me to follow him toward a smaller building, where I could hear low chanting emanating from within. "Tonight, my nephew's soul prepares to journey beyond. Tomorrow we will guide him. But first, you must understand why some rituals remain hidden. Why some knowledge is not meant for casual eyes." As we approached the doorway, I felt a shift in the air, a heaviness that pressed against my chest like invisible hands. Whatever lay beyond that threshold, I sensed it would mark the point of no return. Some experiences change you permanently, and I was about to discover if I had the courage to face one of them. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. In the distance, I could hear the night sounds of the jungle mixing with human voices raised in ancient songs. And somewhere in that blend of natural and supernatural, I realized I was about to witness something that would strip away every comfortable assumption I'd ever held about life, death, and the thin veil that separates them. Ketut paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the wooden doorframe. "Beyond this point," he said quietly, "you are no longer just an observer. You become part of the ritual. The spirits will know you are here. And they will remember." I took a deep breath, tasting incense and rain and something indefinable that seemed to carry the essence of centuries. Then I stepped forward into the unknown. The first thing that struck me was the smell, not unpleasant, but utterly foreign to Western sensibilities. It was the scent of jasmine and sandalwood mixed with something more primal, more immediate. Death, I realized, has its own fragrance here, one that isn't masked or denied but embraced as part of the natural order. The body of Ketut's nephew lay in the center of the room, wrapped in pristine white cloth, surrounded by offerings so intricate they looked like works of art. Family members moved around him with practiced efficiency, their hands performing rituals that had been passed down for over 1,000 years. But it was their faces that captivated me, not grief-stricken or mournful, but intensely focused, as if they were engaged in the most important work of their lives. "This is Memukar," Ketut whispered, positioning himself beside me. "The cleansing. But what you see now, no tourist guidebook describes. This is when we speak directly to the soul, when we help it understand that the time has come to release its hold on this world." An elderly woman, the deceased's grandmother, approached the body with a bowl of water that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. As she began to wash his face, she spoke in low, urgent Balinese, her words carrying an authority that transcended language. I didn't need a translation to understand that she was negotiating, instructing, preparing him for a journey that would take him far from everything familiar. "She is telling him about the path he must walk," Ketut explained, his voice barely audible. "About the obstacles he will face, the demons who will try to confuse him, the lights he must follow and those he must avoid. This knowledge, this specific guidance for the soul's journey, we do not share with outsiders. It is too sacred, too dangerous if misunderstood." As the night progressed, I witnessed rituals within rituals, layers of ceremony that peeled back like an onion, each one revealing something more profound, more mysterious than the last. At one point, a man I hadn't noticed before entered the room carrying what appeared to be an ancient text written on palm leaves. The Pamanku, the temple priest, began reading from it in Sanskrit so old it sounded like the voice of the earth itself. The Usada, Ketut said, noticing my fascination. Instructions for the soul. Maps of the afterworld. Knowledge that has been protected for centuries because in wrong hands, it becomes dangerous. The soul's journey is not a simple thing. There are worlds beyond this world, levels of existence your science doesn't recognize. Without proper guidance, a soul can become lost for lifetimes. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Here was knowledge that predated Christianity, Buddhism, perhaps even recorded history. Here was humanity's oldest attempt to understand the greatest mystery of all: what happens when we die. But as the ceremony continued into the early morning hours, I began to sense something else, a tension in the room that hadn't been there before. Several family members were glancing in my direction, and their expressions weren't entirely welcoming. I was beginning to understand that my presence, however sanctioned by Ketut, was still a disruption in an ancient pattern. The moment of truth came just before dawn, when the Pamanku approached me directly. His eyes held mine for a long moment before he spoke in careful English. You see now why we do not invite strangers to these moments. The work we do here requires purity of intention. When outsiders are present, the energies become confused. The soul becomes uncertain about its path. I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. I wasn't just observing, I was participating whether I intended to or not. My very presence was affecting the spiritual work being done in this room. What do you want me to do? I asked. The Pamanku studied me for another long moment. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. You are here now. The spirits have accepted your presence. But understand, you must see this through to the end. You cannot leave until the soul has departed. To do so would trap it between worlds. And so I found myself committed to a journey I had never imagined, bound by spiritual laws I barely understood, preparing to witness rituals that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of existence itself. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the real ceremony was about to begin. If you've ever wondered what happens when we truly face our mortality, when all pretense and denial are stripped away, tell me in the comments what death means to you. And if this journey into Bali's hidden world intrigues you, subscribe to join me as we explore more of humanity's most guarded secrets. The sun rose blood red over the sacred mountains of Bali, painting the sky in shades that seemed to mirror the profound transformation taking place below. As the village stirred to life around us, I realized I was about to witness something that few Westerners had ever seen: the ancient art of guiding a soul from one world to the next. The night's intimate rituals had been just the beginning. Now, as the Pamanku emerged from the preparation room, his white clothing somehow even more radiant in the morning light, I could see that he had been transformed by the night's work. There was something different about his bearing, his eyes, as if he had tapped into currents of power that ran deeper than anything I could imagine. The soul is ready, he announced to the assembled family. But the real journey begins now. What followed was unlike anything I had expected. The Pamanku led us to a secluded grove behind the village, where ancient stone carvings peeked through centuries of jungle growth. This, I learned, was where the true work of death took place. Not in the public ceremonies that tourists occasionally glimpsed, but in these hidden spaces where the oldest traditions still held sway. The Pamanku began preparing what he called a soul map, a complex arrangement of offerings, symbols, and sacred objects that would serve as a guide for the deceased spirit. Each element had specific meaning, specific power. A single flower placed incorrectly could send a soul wandering for decades. Your Western minds want to understand death as an ending, the Pamanku said as he worked, his hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman. But here death is a doorway. And like any doorway, it can be opened properly or improperly. Open it wrong and the consequences echo through lifetimes. As he spoke, other villagers began arriving, not the extended family I had met the night before, but others whose roles in the ritual were less obvious. An elderly woman carrying a bag of what appeared to be bones. A young man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, symbols I couldn't read but that seemed to pulse with their own energy. A child, no more than 10, whose eyes held wisdom that belonged to someone far older. These are the specialists, Ketut explained quietly. Each one carries knowledge passed down through generations. The bone woman can read the messages left by the ancestors. The marked man can see the paths between worlds. The child can speak with those who have recently crossed over. I watched in fascination as this unlikely team began to work together, their movements choreographed by tradition rather than discussion. The bone woman began arranging skeletal fragments in patterns that made my Western mind recoil, but which clearly held deep meaning for everyone else present. The marked man traced symbols in the air above the deceased, his fingers leaving traces that I could swear remained visible for moments after he had moved on. But it was the child who unsettled me most. As the ceremony progressed, she began speaking in voices that weren't her own, conversations with invisible presences that made the hair on my arms stand up. At one point, she turned to look directly at me and spoke in perfect English, though I had been told she spoke only Balinese. "The foreign one sees but does not understand," she said, her child's voice carrying adult authority. "He thinks death is one thing, but death has many faces. Some peaceful, some terrible. The one who journeys now, he has seen both." Before I could respond, she had turned away, resuming her conversation with the unseen. But her words stayed with me, a reminder that I was witnessing something that operated by rules my rational mind couldn't grasp. As the morning progressed, the ritual grew more intense. The Pamanka began chanting in languages I couldn't identify. Not just Sanskrit but what sounded like older tongues, words that seemed to come from the earth itself. The air around us grew thick and heavy, charged with energy that made my skin tingle. And then, something happened that I still struggle to explain. The space around the deceased's body began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The shimmer intensified, and for a moment, just a moment, I could swear I saw a figure standing beside the physical form. Translucent but unmistakably present. The spirit of Ketut's nephew, preparing to depart. The Pamanka saw it too. His chanting intensified and the specialist began moving with greater urgency. The bone woman started rearranging her patterns, the marked man's symbols became more complex, and the child began speaking faster, her words tumbling over each other in multiple languages. "He's resisting," Ketut whispered, his voice tight with concern. "Sometimes when outsiders are present, the soul becomes curious about foreign worlds. It considers different paths than the ones we have prepared." I felt a stab of guilt so sharp it was physical pain. My presence, my very foreignness, was interfering with this man's spiritual journey. I started to move away, but the Pamanka's voice stopped me. "No. You cannot leave now. Your presence created this complication, and your presence must resolve it. The soul is curious about your world. You must show him why our path is better." I stared at him, completely out of my depth. "I don't understand. How can I show him anything? I can't even see him clearly." "Speak to him," the child said, her voice now definitely not her own. "Tell him about your world. About death and your culture. Let him understand what awaits him if he follows your path instead of ours." And so, feeling more foolish than I had in years, I began to speak to the shimmering space above the deceased's body. I told him about Western death, about hospitals and funeral homes, about embalming and burial, about the isolation and fear that surrounds dying in my culture. I described nursing homes and life support, the medicalization of death, the way we hide our mortality from ourselves until the very end. As I spoke, the shimmer seemed to solidify, and I had the unmistakable sensation of being listened to with intense attention. I found myself describing not just the clinical aspects of Western death, but the spiritual emptiness, the way we treat death as failure rather than transition, the way we leave our dying alone, the way we offer no guidance for the soul's journey because we're not even sure souls exist. In my world, I heard myself saying, death is the end of everything. There is no map, no guide, no community to help with the crossing. Just darkness and uncertainty and the desperate hope that somehow consciousness continues. The effect was immediate. The shimmer began to fade, pulling back toward the physical body. The Pamanka's chanting shifted to a different rhythm, more welcoming, more reassuring. The specialists moved with renewed confidence, their work now proceeding smoothly. "He understands now," the child said, her voice returning to normal. "He sees why our ancestors chose this path. He is ready to follow the proper roads." What happened next was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. The shimmer around the body intensified one final time, and then seemed to gather itself, rising up like mist touched by morning sunlight. For just a moment I could see him clearly, not as he had been in life, but as something more essential, more true. He turned toward each of the family members, and I could feel gratitude flowing from him like warmth from a fire. Then he looked at me, and in his gaze was something I still struggled to name. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Understanding. perhaps even forgiveness for the disruption I had caused. And then he was gone, not fading but simply absent, as if he had stepped through a door that had closed behind him. The grove fell silent except for the sound of wind in the leaves. The specialists began quietly packing their materials, their work complete. The family members embraced, their faces showing not grief but relief, satisfaction, completion. I stood there feeling fundamentally changed by what I had witnessed, knowing that I had been present at something sacred, something that had operated according to laws far older and deeper than anything my culture recognized. But I also knew that this was only the beginning. If I had learned anything from this morning's ritual, it was that death in Bali was far more complex, far more mysterious than I had imagined. And somewhere in the mountains above us, in places even more restricted than this sacred grove, there were rituals and traditions that went even deeper into the heart of the mystery. The Pamanku approached me as the others began to disperse. "You have done well," he said simply. "But understand, what you witnessed here is still only the surface. The real secrets, the deepest knowledge, that is kept in places where even we rarely go." He paused, studying my face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "But perhaps you are ready to learn about those places. Perhaps you are ready to visit the village where death has no smell, where the ancient ones still walk among the living, where the boundaries between worlds are so thin they barely exist." I felt my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I had come to Bali seeking forbidden knowledge, and I was beginning to understand that I had barely scratched the surface of what was possible. "Are you talking about Trunyan?" I asked, naming the village I had heard whispered about in the tourist areas, always with a mixture of fascination and dread. The Pamanku smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Trunyan is what the guides show curious foreigners. What I speak of is older, deeper, more dangerous. A place where the dead do not rest, where they wait and watch and sometimes return." As the implications of his words sank in, I realized that my journey into Bali's forbidden death rituals was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. If you're still with me on this journey, if you're ready to go even deeper into these ancient mysteries, let me know in the comments. The path we're walking gets darker from here, and I want to know I'm not traveling alone. And remember to subscribe, because what's coming next will challenge everything you think you know about life, death, and the spaces between. The boat ride to Trunyan felt like a passage between worlds. Lake Batter stretched before us, its dark waters reflecting the volcanic peaks that ringed the caldera like ancient guardians. But it wasn't the scenic beauty that captured my attention. It was the silence. My Balinese guides had grown increasingly quiet as we made our way toward the most mysterious village on the island. Trunyan isn't marked on most tourist maps, and for good reason. This isolated settlement on the eastern shore of Lake Batter is home to the Bali Aga, the original inhabitants of Bali whose traditions predate Hindu influence by centuries. Here, death is handled in ways that make even other Balinese uncomfortable. Ketut had arranged my passage through connections I was beginning to understand ran deeper than casual friendship. As our boat approached the shore, I could see villagers waiting for us. Not the cheerful welcomes typical of Balinese culture, but watchful figures whose faces revealed nothing. "Remember," Ketut said quietly as we prepared to disembark, "these people follow the old ways. The very old ways. What they practice here is not just ancient. It is sacred in ways that can be dangerous to outsiders who approach without proper respect." The village of Trunyan appeared frozen in time. Traditional houses built on stilts lined the shore, their weathered wood dark with age. But it was what I couldn't see that made my skin crawl. The village of the dead, hidden beyond a screen of trees, where bodies were laid out under open sky to decompose naturally. My escort was a man named Wayan, whose family had been guardians of Trunyan's death rituals for over 20 generations. His English was limited, but his intensity was unmistakable. As we walked through the village, I noticed that the usual sounds of Balinese life, children playing, roosters crowing, the gentle bustle of daily activity, were muted here, as if the very air absorbed sound differently. "You want to see the cemetery?" Wayan said. It wasn't a question. "But first you must understand. What we do here is not for curious eyes. It is for the dead and for those who serve them. You will see things that will stay with you forever. Things that may change how you sleep, how you dream." We stopped at a small temple unlike any I had seen in Bali. The stone carvings were older, cruder, more primal than the elegant Hindu sculptures found elsewhere on the island. At the center stood a statue that made me step back involuntarily, a figure that seemed to blend human and demonic features, its eyes seeming to track my movement. "Ratu Ged Pansering Jugat," Wayan said reverently. "The lord of this place. He who governs the boundary between life and death." Before you enter the cemetery you must ask his permission. What followed was a ritual unlike anything I had experienced. Not the elaborate ceremonies I had witnessed elsewhere in Bali, but something rawer, more direct. Wayan spoke to the statue in Old Balinese, his words carrying an urgency that needed no translation. I found myself genuinely frightened, not by anything I could see, but by the sense that I was in the presence of forces that operated by rules my rational mind couldn't grasp. When Wayan finished, he studied the statue's face for a long moment. Then he nodded. He allows it. But he watches. Remember that. The path to the cemetery wound through jungle so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, heavier, charged with an energy that raised the hair on my arms. And then gradually I became aware of a smell, not the stench of decay I had expected, but something else entirely. Sweet, almost floral, but with an underlying complexity that seemed to speak of transformation rather than corruption. The Teru Menyen, Wayan said, pointing ahead to a massive tree that dominated the clearing we were approaching. More than 1,000 years old. Its roots drink from the sacred springs, its branches touch the world of spirits. It cleanses the air, purifies the transition. Without it, what we do here would be impossible. And then we entered the cemetery proper, and I understood why this place was hidden from the world. Bodies lay arranged on the ground, wrapped in white cloth, protected by bamboo enclosures that looked like elaborate cages. But these weren't recent deaths. Some of the cloth was yellowed with age, some of the bamboo structures showed years of weathering. And yet, the air remained clean, almost sweet, as if death itself had been transformed into something else entirely. 11, Wayan said, gesturing to the arranged bodies. Always 11. When one completes the journey to bone, another may take its place. The balance must be maintained. I walked among the silent figures, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't burial, wasn't cremation. This was something else entirely. A kind of slow, sacred transformation where the boundary between life and death became permeable, negotiable. At the far end of the cemetery, I saw them. The skulls and bones of those who had completed their journey. Arranged on stone platforms, they seemed less like remains than like presences. Watching, waiting, somehow still participating in the life of the village. They do not leave us, Wayan explained, following my gaze. Death here is not an ending but how do you say, a changing of form. They are still here, still part of the community. Sometimes, when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the lake, they walk among us. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Walk among you? Wayan's smile was enigmatic. You are a visitor to this world. You see only surfaces. But we who live here, we know the deeper truths. Death is not the wall your people believe it to be. It is more like a thin curtain. And sometimes that curtain moves. As if to underscore his words, a wind arose in the clearing, stirring the bamboo enclosures, making them creak and whisper. For a moment I could swear I heard voices in that sound, not words I could understand but something that conveyed meaning nonetheless. They know you are here, Wayan said quietly. The recently dead are curious about outsiders. They remember life, remember the world beyond this place. Sometimes they have questions. The wind intensified and the whispers grew clearer. I found myself straining to listen, to understand, feeling drawn into a conversation I couldn't quite join but couldn't ignore. That's when I saw her. At the edge of my vision, barely visible, a figure stood among the bamboo structures. Translucent, wavering like heat haze but unmistakably human. A young woman, her face turned toward me with an expression of profound curiosity. She died 3 months ago, Wayan said calmly, apparently seeing her too. A fever took her quickly. She has been restless, asking about the world beyond our village. Perhaps she senses that you have traveled far. I stared at the apparition, my rational mind insisting this was impossible while my deeper instincts recognized something fundamentally real. She moved closer, and I could see her mouth moving as if speaking, though I heard nothing. What is she saying? I managed to ask. Wayan listened for a moment, his head tilted as if catching whispers on the wind. She asks about your world. About how your people die, where your spirits go. She has heard rumors of a place where the dead are cut off from the living, where they cannot return even to say goodbye. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. This young woman, recently dead, was curious about Western concepts of death, about a finality so complete it severed all connection between the living and the dead. And somehow, her curiosity was making her visible to me. Tell her, I found myself saying, though I felt foolish speaking to empty air. Tell her about our funerals, our cemeteries, our complete separation of the living from the dead. Wayan translated, and I watched the spirit's face change as she absorbed the information. Horror was too simple a word for her expression. It was deeper than that, a profound sadness mixed with disbelief. She says she does not understand how spirits can survive in such isolation, Wei-yin reported. How they can find their way without guidance, without the voices of their families to call them home. And in that moment, I understood something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. In trying to protect ourselves from the reality of death, Western culture had created something far more terrible than any ghost story. We had created a kind of spiritual solitary confinement for the dead. The spirit turned away, fading back into the shadows between the bamboo structures. But her questions lingered in the air like an accusation. What had we done to our dead? What had we done to ourselves? As the afternoon wore on, I witnessed more than just the peaceful decomposition of bodies. I saw a community that maintained active relationships with death, that treated the recently deceased as temporary neighbors rather than lost memories. Children brought offerings to the cemetery, elderly villagers stopped by to share gossip with skulls that somehow seemed to listen. "This is why your people find us disturbing," Wei-yin said as we prepared to leave. "Not because we expose our dead to the air, but because we refuse to let death be final. We insist on connection, on continuity, on relationships that transcend the physical." As our boat pulled away from Trunyan's shore, I looked back at the village with new understanding. This wasn't primitive or savage. It was perhaps the most sophisticated approach to death I had ever encountered. A system that acknowledged mortality while refusing to accept disconnection. But even as I processed what I had learned, Wei-yin's words echoed in my mind. "You have seen the surface but not the depths. There are ceremonies here that happen only when the stars align properly, rituals that open doors we usually keep closed. If you truly want to understand death, you must witness the forbidden ceremony. The one we call the calling back." I felt my heart racing with anticipation and fear. Just when I thought I had reached the limits of what was possible, another door had opened, leading deeper into mysteries I was only beginning to comprehend. The path ahead promised to be darker, more dangerous, more transformative than anything I had yet experienced. And I knew I had no choice but to follow it to its conclusion. The best and perhaps the most terrifying was yet to come. The message came 3 days later, delivered by a child who appeared at my hotel in Ubud just before dawn. She handed me a piece of palm leaf with symbols I couldn't read, then vanished back into the pre-dawn darkness before I could ask any questions. Ketut arrived an hour later, his face grave as he examined the inscription. "They have agreed," he said simply. "But understand, what they offer you has never been given to an outsider. The calling back ceremony happens perhaps once in a generation, and only when the conditions are perfect. The stars, the moon, the spiritual energy of the place, everything must align." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Once you witness this, you will be forever changed. There is no going back to the simple understanding of death you carried before. Are you certain you want this knowledge?" I thought about the spirits I had seen in Trunyan, about the young woman whose questions about Western death had revealed the spiritual poverty of my own culture. I had come too far to turn back now. "Yes," I said. "I'm certain." The journey back to Trunyan took place under a new moon, the darkness so complete it seemed to swallow our boat whole. But this time we weren't alone. Other boats moved across the black water, carrying villagers from settlements around the lake. People I was told came perhaps once in their lifetimes to witness what we were about to see. Trunyan looked different in the absolute darkness. Oil lamps flickered in windows like distant stars, and I could hear voices singing, not the cheerful songs of celebration, but something deeper, more primal. Music that seemed to come from the earth itself. Wei-yin met us at the shore, but he too was transformed. Gone was the simple village guardian I had met before. Tonight, he wore traditional ceremonial dress and carried implements I didn't recognize, tools that looked ancient and somehow dangerous. "The calling back," he said without preamble, "is not for the curious. It is for the desperate. When a death has been incomplete. When a spirit has refused to follow the proper path. When the living need to speak to the dead one final time before letting them go." He led us not to the cemetery I had visited before, but deeper into the jungle, to a clearing I hadn't known existed. At its center stood a structure that made my breath catch, an ancient stone circle, older than anything I had seen in Bali, covered with carvings that seemed to move in the lamplight. "Pre-Hindu," Wei-yin explained, following my gaze. "From the time when our ancestors first learned to speak with the dead. Tonight we use it for its original purpose." Other villagers began arriving, carrying items I couldn't identify, bones, stones, plants that glowed phosphorescent in the darkness. An elderly woman I recognized as the bone reader from my earlier ceremony approached carrying what looked like a human skull covered in gold leaf. "The anchor," Wayan said quietly. "Every calling back requires an anchor, something that belonged to the one we seek to call. This skull belonged to Wayan's grandfather, who died 50 years ago but has never fully departed. His family needs to speak with him one final time." As the villagers arranged themselves around the stone circle, I began to understand the magnitude of what I was about to witness. This wasn't just communication with the dead. This was an attempt to temporarily reverse death itself, to pull a spirit back across the boundary for a conversation that could reshape the destiny of both the living and the dead. The ceremony began with the bone reader placing the golden skull at the center of the stone circle. Around it she arranged other objects, crystals, flowers, substances I couldn't identify but that made the air shimmer with energy. The singing intensified, and I realized that what I had taken for random melody was actually precise incantation, each note designed to thin the barriers between worlds. Wayan began chanting in the oldest language I had ever heard. Not Sanskrit, not Balinese, but something that seemed to predate human speech entirely. Words that sounded like wind through caves, like water over stone, like the voice of the earth itself. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the clearing dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. The flames of the oil lamps began to flicker and dance, though there was no wind. And the golden skull at the center of the circle began to glow, not with reflected light, but with illumination that seemed to come from within. "He hears us," the bone reader announced, her voice carrying across the clearing like an echo. "But he is reluctant. Death has been kind to him. He does not wish to remember the pain of life." Wayan's chanting intensified, joined now by other voices around the circle. The golden glow of the skull began to spread, creating a column of light that extended up into the darkness. And within that column I began to see movement, not solid, but more substantial than the spirits I had glimpsed before. A figure began to form in the light, an old man, his features becoming clearer with each passing moment. But what struck me most was his expression. Not peaceful, not welcoming, but confused and somewhat annoyed, like someone awakened from deep sleep. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the night air like wind through leaves. He spoke in Balinese, but somehow I understood every word, not intellectually but on a deeper level, as if the meaning was being imprinted directly onto my consciousness. "Why do you disturb my rest?" he asked, his ghostly features settling into a frown. "I have walked beyond the world of sorrows. I have found peace in the realm of pure water. Why do you call me back to this place of suffering?" A younger man stepped forward from the circle. His grandson, I realized, bearing a family resemblance even across the boundary of death. "Grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you left us without sharing the location of the family's sacred objects. The Dutch war took our house, scattered our belongings. We need your guidance to recover what was lost." The spirit's expression softened, and I saw something that made my heart ache. The moment when love overcame death, when familial bonds proved stronger than the pull of eternity. "Ah, my child," the spirit said, his voice growing warmer. "You have grown tall since I last saw you. Your father did well with your upbringing." What followed was a conversation that redefined my understanding of death and memory. The spirit not only recalled the location of buried family treasures, but shared wisdom about living descendants he couldn't possibly have encountered since his death. He spoke of great-grandchildren born after his passing, of family crises that had occurred decades later, of guidance the living needed to navigate challenges he had never witnessed in life. "How does he know these things?" I whispered to Wayan. "Death is not the end of caring," he replied quietly. "Love creates connections that transcend physical existence. He has been watching, guiding, protecting, even from beyond. The calling back simply makes the connection visible." But as the conversation continued, I began to notice something else. The spirit was becoming more solid, more present, while the living grandson was becoming paler, weaker. Energy was flowing between them, but not in the direction I expected. "The danger," Wayan said, seeing my concern. "The living can become lost in these conversations. The pull of the dead can be stronger than the pull of life, especially when love is involved. This is why the ceremony requires such careful preparation, such precise timing." Indeed, I could see the grandson swaying on his feet, his eyes becoming unfocused, as if he was being drawn into the column of light where his grandfather waited. Other family members began chanting more urgently, their voices designed to anchor the living to the world of flesh and breath. The bone reader stepped forward, raising her hands in a gesture that seemed to push the spirit back. "Enough," she commanded. You have shared what was needed. Now you must return to your rest, and your grandson must return to his life. The spirit's face showed something I hadn't expected, reluctance mixed with sadness. Must I go so soon? He asked. It has been so long since I could speak with my family, since I could offer them guidance directly. Your time of guidance is not over, the bone reader replied firmly. But it must return to its proper channels. Through dreams, through signs, through the subtle influences that do not drain the living of their own energy. Go now with our love and gratitude. The spirit looked directly at his grandson one last time. Remember, he said, his voice already beginning to fade. The strength of our family lies not in what we possess, but in how we care for each other across all boundaries. I watch over you always. The column of light began to diminish, and the spirit grew translucent once again. But just before he disappeared completely, he turned toward me, his ancient eyes meeting mine across the impossible distance between life and death. 4-in-1, he said, his voice now barely a whisper. You have seen great mysteries tonight. But understand, with knowledge comes responsibility. You carry our secrets now. Use them wisely. And then he was gone, leaving only the golden skull and the memory of an encounter that had shaken the foundations of everything I thought I knew about existence. As the villagers began packing their ceremonial tools, I stood in the darkness trying to process what I had witnessed. I had seen death reversed even temporarily. I had watched love transcend the ultimate boundary. I had witnessed the living and the dead engage in conversation as naturally as neighbors discussing the weather. But I had also seen the danger inherent in such practices. The way the dead could drain the living, the temptation to lose oneself in conversations with those we had lost. I understood now why such ceremonies were rare, why they required such careful preparation and skilled guidance. Wei-Yin approached me as the clearing emptied. Now you understand, he said quietly. Death is not the enemy your culture believes it to be. But it is also not something to be treated lightly. It requires respect, understanding, proper boundaries. What we do here, it is not about conquering death but about living in harmony with it. As we made our way back through the jungle toward the village, I realized that my journey into Bali's forbidden death rituals was nearing its end. But the knowledge I had gained, the experiences I had shared, these would stay with me forever, changing not just how I thought about death but how I lived life itself. The path ahead led back to my own world, but I would never again be the person who had first set foot on this island. Some transformations are irreversible, and I had chosen to embrace one of the most profound of all. The spirits had accepted me, taught me, trusted me with their deepest secrets. Now the question was, what would I do with that knowledge? The answer to that question would shape the rest of my life. The helicopter blades cut through the morning air as we rose above Lake Batter, the ancient volcano falling away beneath us like a sleeping giant. But I wasn't leaving Bali, not yet. There was one final ritual I needed to complete, one last boundary to cross before my journey into the forbidden heart of death could truly end. Ketut sat beside me, his weathered hands gripping a small urn that contained something I had never expected to carry, ashes from the calling back ceremony. Not human ashes, but the remains of offerings, of sacred substances that had been transformed by their contact with the returning spirit. These ashes, he had explained, carried within them the essence of the conversation between worlds. The final stage, he had said as we prepared for this flight, is not about witnessing death or communicating with the dead. It is about integration. About carrying the knowledge forward. About becoming a bridge between your world and ours. Our destination was Mount Agung, Bali's highest and most sacred peak. Here, in a temple that clung to the mountainside like a prayer carved in stone, I would participate in the final ritual, one that would seal my transformation from observer to participant, from outsider to keeper of ancient secrets. The temple was older than any structure I had seen on the island, its stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. At its heart stood a shrine unlike anything in conventional Balinese Hinduism, a structure that seemed to bend space around itself, creating shadows that fell in impossible directions. Pre-Hindu, pre-Buddhist, pre-everything, Ketut explained as we approached. This is where our ancestors first learned that death was not an ending but a transformation. Where they discovered that with proper preparation, proper intention, the boundaries between worlds could be adjusted. The priest waiting for us was unlike any I had encountered. Ancient beyond measure, his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect centuries of accumulated wisdom. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of mountains, of time itself. You have seen our secrets, he said without preamble. You have witnessed our deepest mysteries. But knowledge without integration is dangerous. To you, to us, to the balance between worlds. Today you must choose: carry this knowledge forward as a sacred trust, or have it removed from your memory forever. I stared at him, realizing that this had always been building to this moment. Everything I had experienced, the night vigils, the sacred ceremonies, the communication with the dead, it had all been a test. A way of determining whether I could be trusted with knowledge that could reshape entire cultures' relationships with mortality. What does carrying it forward mean? I asked. The ancient priest smiled, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw warmth in his expression. It means you become a bridge. You return to your world carrying our understanding, but you do so responsibly. You share what can be shared, protect what must be protected. You help your people understand that death is not the enemy, but a teacher, perhaps the most important teacher of all. He gestured toward the shrine at the temple's heart. The choice is yours. Step forward and accept the responsibility of becoming a keeper of mysteries. Or step back and return to your world unchanged, with only vague memories of an unusual vacation in Bali. The urn in Ketut's hand seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The ashes of transformation, of communication between worlds, of love that transcended death itself. Everything I had witnessed, everything I had learned, was contained within that simple vessel. I thought about the spirits I had encountered, the curious young woman in Trunyan, the grandfather called back from peaceful rest to guide his family. I thought about the Western world's sterile approach to death, our fear-based denial of mortality, our spiritual poverty in the face of life's greatest mystery. The choice was really no choice at all. I stepped forward. What happened next defied description. As the ancient priest began chanting in languages that predated recorded history, the shrine began to glow with the same inner light I had seen during the calling back ceremony. But this was different, not the cold illumination of death, but the warm radiance of life transformed, of wisdom integrated, of boundaries dissolved and reformed. The ashes from Ketut's urn rose into the air, forming patterns that my mind couldn't quite grasp but my soul understood completely. They swirled around me like living smoke, and wherever they touched my skin I felt change. Not physical change, but something deeper, the installation of new capacities, new understandings, new responsibilities. I could feel the weight of centuries settling onto my shoulders, but it wasn't oppressive. It was empowering. I was being trusted with knowledge that had been protected for millennia, and with that trust came the strength to carry it properly. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the swirling ashes suddenly compressed, flowing into my chest like water absorbed by sand. For a moment, I felt the presence of every spirit I had encountered on this journey, not just as memories, but as living connections, permanent links between my consciousness and the realm beyond death. Then gradually the light faded and the chanting stopped. I stood in the temple's stone embrace, fundamentally changed but still recognizably myself. The ancient priest studied my face with satisfaction. "It is done," he said simply. "You are no longer merely a visitor to our mysteries. You are part of them now, and they are part of you. Use this gift wisely." As we made our way down the mountain, I felt the full weight of what had happened. I carried within me not just knowledge about Balinese death rituals, but a living connection to them. I could feel the spirits I had encountered, still present, still available for guidance and conversation. But more importantly, I understood how to approach death, my own and others, as a transformation rather than a termination. The flight back to Ubud gave me time to process the magnitude of my transformation. I looked down at the island that had become sacred ground for me, knowing that I would carry its lessons far beyond its shores. But I also knew that this was not an ending, it was a beginning. The real work lay ahead, in finding ways to share these insights with a world desperately in need of a healthier relationship with mortality. Ketut spoke only once during the flight. "Remember," he said, "the spirits trust you now. Don't disappoint them." As I write these words, months later, in my study half a world away from Bali, I can still feel that trust like a weight and a blessing combined. The knowledge I gained during those transformative days has indeed changed everything: how I approach my own mortality, how I comfort the dying, how I understand the relationship between love and loss. But perhaps most importantly, it has shown me that the boundaries we think divide life from death, the living from the dead, the known from the unknown, these boundaries are far more permeable than we imagine. Death is not the end of the conversation but a change in its medium. Love does not stop at the grave but finds new ways to express itself. And the ancient mysteries that our modern world has forgotten are still available to those brave enough to seek them out. I have been forever changed by my encounter with Bali's forbidden rituals. I have looked death in the face and found not an enemy but a teacher. I have spoken with the dead and learned from their wisdom. I have witnessed ceremonies that challenge everything our modern world believes about the nature of existence itself. And now, I carry this knowledge forward as I promised I would. Not as entertainment or curiosity, but as sacred trust, a bridge between worlds, a reminder that death is not the opposite of life but its most profound teacher. The spirits are still with me. They always will be. And through me they continue their work of teaching the living how to die well, how to love beyond loss, how to find meaning in the face of mortality. This is their gift to us all. This is the wisdom of Bali's forbidden rituals. This is what it means to truly face death and find not darkness, but transformation. The journey ends but the teaching continues. And in that continuation, I have found something worth more than life itself. The understanding that love, properly expressed, makes even death just another beginning. What did you think of this journey into Bali's most sacred mysteries? Have you ever experienced something that completely changed your relationship with mortality? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration of life's deepest questions resonated with you, please subscribe to join me as we continue to explore the hidden corners of human experience, the places where ancient wisdom meets modern questions, and the mysteries that connect us all. The conversation between life and death continues, and you're invited to be part of it.